The concert hall buzzed with anticipation as thousands of people filled every seat, their voices creating a low hum of excitement that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was a cold November evening in London, and outside the historic venue, hundreds more stood hoping for last-minute tickets or simply to catch a glimpse of the artist arriving. Inside, the ornate ceiling stretched high above rows of plush red seats, and the stage stood empty except for a single piano positioned at its center under a soft spotlight. The crowd represented every age and background, from teenagers clutching their phones to elderly couples who had waited decades for this moment. Among them sat a young music journalist named Sarah Chen, her notebook already open on her lap, her pen ready to capture something she hoped would be extraordinary. Sarah had been assigned this story 3 weeks earlier by her editor at a major arts magazine. Her task seemed simple enough on the surface: attend the concert, write a review, and submit it by morning. But Sarah knew this assignment meant more than just another review. The musician performing tonight had practically vanished from public life for nearly 8 years, retreating from the spotlight after a series of personal tragedies that had been dissected mercilessly by the media. There had been a divorce that played out in tabloid headlines, the loss of a parent to a long illness, and rumors of creative burnout that the artist never confirmed or denied. Then came the silence. No new albums, no tour, no interviews, nothing. The world moved on, as it always does, but true fans never stopped wondering if they would hear that voice again, if those hands would return to the piano keys that had once created magic. When the announcement came 6 weeks ago that a single concert would be performed, tickets sold out in under 4 minutes. Scalpers immediately listed seats for 10 times their face value. Social media exploded with speculation about what the performance would include and whether this signaled a full comeback or simply a brief farewell. Sarah had been lucky to secure a press pass, though her seat was far from ideal, positioned in the upper balcony on the left side of the hall. Still, she felt grateful to be present at all. She had grown up listening to this musician's albums, had played them during her own difficult moments, and had written her college thesis partially about the way the artist's lyrics captured the complexity of human emotion without ever becoming sentimental or cheap. As she settled into her seat, Sarah noticed the diversity of emotions on the faces around her. Some people looked nervous, almost afraid, as if worried that the performance might somehow tarnish their memories or fail to live up to impossible expectations built over years of absence. Others appeared purely joyful, grinning and chatting with strangers about favorite songs and memorable past concerts. A woman in the row ahead of Sarah quietly wiped tears from her eyes even though nothing had happened yet, and Sarah understood that feeling completely. Sometimes anticipation itself becomes overwhelming when something matters deeply. The house lights dimmed at exactly 8 o'clock, and the crowd's noise dropped to immediate silence. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she gripped her pen tighter. The spotlight on the piano seemed to grow brighter in contrast to the darkened hall. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched out, became almost uncomfortable, and Sarah wondered if there was some technical delay. Then, from the wings of the stage, a figure emerged, walking slowly and deliberately toward the piano. The crowd erupted instantly into thunderous applause that shook the building. People jumped to their feet, shouting and clapping with an intensity that felt almost desperate, as if trying to communicate 8 years of longing and loyalty through sheer volume. Sarah stood with everyone else, her notebook temporarily forgotten, watching as the musician acknowledged the ovation with a small wave and a genuine smile that seemed both grateful and slightly overwhelmed. The artist looked different from old photographs, older certainly, with gray streaks visible in dark hair, but there was something else too. Something in the posture and expression that suggested hard-won peace rather than the haunted intensity that had marked earlier public appearances. The applause continued for minutes, showing no signs of stopping, and finally the musician gestured gently for people to sit, taking a seat at the piano bench and adjusting the microphone with familiar, practiced movements. As the crowd reluctantly settled back into their seats, still buzzing with energy, Sarah picked up her pen again and wrote a single sentence at the top of her page. "Some returns are about more than music." She had no idea yet how true those words would prove to be, or how this single evening would change not only her understanding of art and resilience, but also the trajectory of her own career and life. The musician's fingers hovered above the piano keys for just a moment before pressing down, and the first notes filled the concert hall with a clarity that seemed to cut through the air itself. Sarah recognized the song immediately, though she had never heard it performed live before. It was from the third album, a piece called Watershed that had always been a favorite among dedicated fans, but had never achieved mainstream radio success. The choice felt deliberate, a signal that this performance would not pander to casual listeners or rely on greatest hits to carry the evening. This was going to be something deeper, more personal, more raw. As the melody unfolded, Sarah found herself leaning forward in her seat, straining to catch every nuance of the performance. The musician's voice, when it joined the piano, sounded different from the recordings she had memorized years ago. It carried more texture now, more weight and grain, as if life itself had been absorbed into the vocal cords and was now being released through each carefully shaped phrase. There was less technical perfection perhaps, but far more emotional truth. The lyrics spoke of transformation and acceptance, of learning to live with loss rather than trying to overcome it, and hearing them delivered by someone who had clearly walked that difficult path gave them a power that studio recordings could never capture. Around her, Sarah noticed that the audience had fallen into an almost reverent silence. People sat perfectly still, many with closed eyes, letting the music wash over them without distraction. The woman in front of her continued to cry quietly, and Sarah saw others dabbing at their own eyes as well. She felt her own throat tighten with emotion, though she fought to maintain the professional distance she knew her assignment required. She scribbled quick notes about the arrangement, the pacing, the way the artist used silence as effectively as sound, but part of her mind remained fully absorbed in simply experiencing what was happening. The first song ended, and before the applause could properly begin, the musician transitioned immediately into the second piece, a faster number that had been a radio hit 15 years earlier. But this version bore little resemblance to the upbeat pop arrangement that had once dominated airwaves. Instead, the tempo had been slowed, the production stripped away entirely, leaving only piano and voice to carry a song that now revealed depths of melancholy hidden beneath its originally cheerful surface. It was a bold reinterpretation, the kind that risked alienating fans who loved the original, but Sarah heard appreciative murmurs around her as people recognized what was being offered. This was not nostalgia or simple repetition. This was an artist in genuine dialogue with their own past work, showing how time and experience had changed the meaning of words written in a different lifetime. Song followed song, each one carefully chosen and reimagined. The musician spoke very little between pieces, offering only brief comments that were more observations than explanations. After a particularly haunting rendition of an old ballad, the artist paused and said simply, "I forgot how much I needed this," and the crowd responded with warm applause that felt like an embrace. Sarah wrote down the quote, underlining it twice, sensing that it captured something essential about what was unfolding. This was not a triumphant comeback performance by someone who had conquered their demons and emerged victorious. This was something more humble and human, a person reconnecting with the work that had once defined them and discovering that it still held meaning, perhaps even more meaning than before. Midway through the concert, the musician paused longer than usual and adjusted the microphone closer. "I want to play something I wrote last month," came the quiet announcement. "I haven't decided if it belongs on a record or if it should just live here tonight, but I'd like to share it with you." The crowd stirred with excitement at the prospect of new material, but Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety on behalf of the artist. Debuting a brand new song in the middle of such a highly anticipated performance was risky, especially when the audience had come primarily to hear familiar beloved pieces. But as the first notes emerged, Sarah understood the choice. The new song picked up threads from the older material, but wove them into something distinctly different, something that could only have been created by someone who had walked away and then chosen to return. The lyrics spoke directly about absence and rediscovery, about finding that the things we run from often contain what we most need. The audience listened with complete attention, and when the song ended, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Sarah saw people nodding to each other, smiling with what looked like relief or validation. The new work was good, genuinely good, and it suggested that this return was not just about revisiting past glories, but about continuing to create and grow. Sarah filled another page with observations, trying to capture the atmosphere in the hall, the sense of collective witnessing that had transformed a simple concert into something approaching a communal ritual. As the performance continued, Sarah began to notice something she had not expected. She had come prepared to write about a musician, to analyze technique and song choice and stage presence. But what she was actually observing was a masterclass in vulnerability and courage. Every song required the artist to open old wounds, to revisit difficult memories and painful periods, all while thousands of strangers watched and listened. Yet there was no self-pity in the delivery, no manipulation of the audience's emotions. Instead, there was honesty presented without armor or pretense, an offering made freely with no guarantee of how it would be received. Sarah realized she was witnessing not just a concert, but a profound act of trust between an artist and an audience, a mutual agreement that this space and time would be used for something real rather than something merely entertaining. The setlist moved chronologically through the musician's catalog, each era represented by carefully selected pieces that tracked a journey from youthful ambition through success, crisis, silence, and now tentative renewal. Sarah found herself thinking about her own life, her own retreats and returns, the times she had abandoned things she loved because they became too difficult or painful. She wondered how many others in the audience were having similar reflections, using the music as a mirror for their own experiences. Art at its best does this, she thought, creates a framework within which people can examine their own lives and find meaning or consolation or challenge. As the concert moved into its final third, the energy in the hall shifted again. What had been reverent and slightly sad earlier now took on notes of celebration and even joy. The musician's body language changed too, becoming more relaxed and animated, sometimes smiling between songs or sharing small anecdotes about how particular pieces came to be written. It felt as though some burden had been lifted during the performance itself, as though the act of playing and singing had accomplished some necessary healing or reconnection. Sarah wrote quickly, trying to keep up with her impressions, already thinking about how she would structure her article, what details would best convey the remarkable thing she was experiencing. 10:40 p.m. The final song came without announcement, simply emerging from the silence after the previous piece ended. Sarah recognized it instantly, and from the collective intake of breath around her, so did everyone else. It was the song that had started everything, the breakthrough hit from the very first album, the piece that had introduced this musician to the world nearly 20 years ago. But unlike the earlier reinterpretations, this one stayed remarkably close to the original arrangement. The familiar melody unfolded exactly as Sarah remembered it from countless listens, and yet somehow it sounded completely new. Perhaps it was the accumulation of everything that had come before in the concert. Or perhaps it was simply the passage of time and all that had happened in the years between. But the song now carried layers of meaning that the younger version of this artist could never have imagined. The lyrics told a simple story about hope and possibility, about believing that life could become something beautiful despite current difficulties. When first released, critics had praised it as an optimistic anthem for a generation. Now, delivered by someone who had experienced the full complexity of what life actually offers, both wonderful and terrible, the same words became something else entirely. They became not naive hope but hard-won faith, not innocent belief but conscious choice to keep moving forward despite everything. Sarah felt tears finally escape her own professional composure as she listened, understanding in a way she never had before that hope itself transforms over a lifetime, that the hope of youth and the hope of experience are fundamentally different things, and that perhaps the latter is more valuable precisely because it knows what it's up against. The musician's voice strengthened as the song built toward its conclusion, and the piano playing became more forceful, more insistent. The audience remained silent, holding their collective breath, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air as everyone sensed the performance approaching its end. When the final chord was struck and held, allowed to ring out and slowly fade into silence, no one moved. The hall sat in absolute quiet for several long seconds, as if afraid that applause might shatter something precious and fragile that had been created over the past 2 hours. Then someone in the orchestra section stood, and immediately everyone else followed. The applause started as a wave from the front and swept backward through the entire venue, growing in volume and intensity until it became a roar. People shouted and whistled, and Sarah saw that nearly everyone around her was crying now, herself included. She stood with the others, clapping until her hands hurt, watching as the musician rose from the piano bench and bowed deeply, clearly moved by the response. The artist's eyes were wet too, and there was a smile of such genuine happiness and relief that Sarah felt her heart might break from witnessing it. The ovation continued for minutes, people refusing to stop, calling out words of love and encouragement. The musician bowed again, placed a hand over their heart in a gesture of gratitude, and then walked toward the wings. But the applause did not diminish, and after a moment the artist returned to the piano. Without sitting, leaning down to speak into the microphone, came the words, "Thank you for waiting for me and thank you for being here tonight. I did not know if I would ever do this again, and you made it everything I hoped it could be." The simple statement brought fresh waves of applause and emotion from the crowd. Then, surprisingly, the musician sat back down at the piano. "One more," came the quiet promise, and the audience immediately settled, eager for whatever gift was about to be offered. What followed was a song Sarah had never heard before, another brand new piece that seemed to have been written specifically for this moment. The lyrics spoke directly about return and reunion, about discovering that the things we love do not abandon us even when we abandon them, about finding the courage to try again after failure or loss. It was achingly beautiful, spare, and honest, and it felt like both a gift to the audience and a declaration of intent. This musician was not finished creating, not finished contributing, not finished being part of the world that had once felt too overwhelming to face. When this final encore ended, the applause somehow surpassed everything that had come before. People hugged strangers next to them, laughed and cried simultaneously, and refused to leave even as the house lights came up. The musician stood at the piano, waving and bowing, visibly overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. Sarah watched it all, still scribbling notes though her hand cramped from writing, determined to capture every detail of this extraordinary conclusion. Eventually, the artist left the stage for the final time, and slowly, reluctantly, the audience began to gather their belongings and move toward the exits. But the mood was unlike any concert ending Sarah had ever experienced. People walked slowly, talking in hushed reverent tones, many still wiping their eyes. In the lobby, strangers compared their experiences, sharing what particular moments had moved them most, exchanging contact information as if they had been through something together that created lasting bonds. Sarah lingered, listening to these conversations, gathering material for her article but also simply wanting to extend the experience a little longer. Outside the venue, the November cold hit sharply, but hundreds of people remained on the sidewalk, unwilling to disperse into the night. Some took photographs of the building's facade, others simply stood talking, and a few hardy souls started singing one of the songs from the concert, their voices rising into the dark sky. Sarah stood among them, her notebook finally closed, her assignment complete but her mind still racing with thoughts about what she had witnessed. She thought about the musician's 8-year absence and the courage it must have taken to step back onto that stage. She thought about the audience and their unwavering loyalty, their willingness to wait and hope without guarantees. She thought about her own relationship to her work, the times she had considered walking away from journalism because it felt too difficult or unrewarding. This concert had been about music, certainly, but it had also been about something larger, something to do with persistence and faith, with the possibility of renewal even after long darkness, with the ways that art and community can sustain people through the hardest passages of life. As Sarah finally began walking toward the tube station, her phone buzzed with a message from her editor asking when she could have the review ready. She smiled and typed back that she would need until morning, that she had a lot to process and wanted to get it right. This was not just another concert review, she knew. This was something more important, a story about what happens when talent meets courage, when an artist chooses vulnerability over safety, when an audience offers unconditional support rather than judgment. She had arrived at the concert hall as a journalist assigned to cover a performance. She was leaving as someone who had witnessed something that would change how she thought about her own life and work. The next morning, Sarah's article would be published and shared thousands of times across social media. Other journalists would cite it in their own pieces about the concert. The musician would later say, in a rare interview, that reading it had helped clarify the decision to fully return to performing and recording. But none of that had happened yet. For now, Sarah simply rode the night train home, her notebook full of observations, her heart full of something she could not quite name but knew she would spend years trying to understand and articulate. The applause had finally ended, but its echoes would continue resonating for a very long time, in her life and in the lives of everyone who had been present to witness a remarkable human being choose to try again, to risk again, to believe again that what they had to offer still mattered and might still bring light into a world that desperately needed it. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.